For 6 years, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca harassed the Romans occupying Sicily. From his base high on Mount Eryx, he would perform frequent sneak attacks and raids on enemy garrisons. And then, suddenly, while planning his next move, Hamilcar got the news that the First Punic War had ended. Although undefeated, Hamilcar lost the war and would have to negotiate the terms with the Romans. In the last years of the conflict, the Carthaginians were pushed back all the way to the west, clinging to only two strongholds, Lilybaeum and Drepana. Both of them being port towns easily supplied by sea, they could endure a siege as long as the trading corridor stayed open. The Romans had no other choice but to build a brand new fleet after losing the last one in a storm several years ago. With this fleet, the Romans destroyed the Carthaginians at sea. The road was now open for another invasion of Africa, and Carthage had to sue for peace in 241 BCE. It fell to Hamilcar, as the leader of the Sicilian force, to negotiate with his sworn enemies. In the end, the Carthaginians had to leave Sicily and pay a large indemnity to Rome. 1,000 talents were to be paid immediately, with a further 2,200 over the next 10 years. After securing peace, Hamilcar left for Carthage, leaving 20,000 of his soldiers stranded on the west coast of Sicily. The command was now passed down to Gisco, who was second in command. In contrast to the Roman citizen army, the Carthaginian force was a mix of Libyan conscripts and a wide range of mercenaries, mainly Celts, Ligurians and Balearians. There were also some Greeks and Italians, but in smaller numbers. Some of these troops have been employed for decades, and they will have to be paid handsomely. Gisco knew that recent events would make this difficult, so he transferred the troops to Africa, unit by unit. This would then buy some time, allowing Carthage to pay each unit as they came in. But when Gisco arrived at Carthage with the last batch of troops, he realized that none of them were paid and all 20,000 soldiers were still in Carthage. The construction of a new fleet and the indemnity paid to Rome left the Carthaginian treasury almost completely empty. Rather than paying each group as they came in, the leaders in Carthage decided to wait for all the troops to arrive and then negotiate a lower pay with all of them. It's unknown how much Carthage actually owed to the mercenaries. According to some estimates, based on known figures from the Greek world, the 20,000-strong army would cost Carthage around 2,200 talents each year. Roman naval blockade in 242 BCE prevented Carthaginians from paying their dues, meaning that they owed 2 years' pay at the minimum, or more than 4,400 talents. To put these numbers into perspective, the entire state income of Carthage in 193 BCE is estimated at around 1,600 talents. Carthage probably had a way to pay off this debt, as we will soon see, but there were more compelling reasons not to, at least not the full amount. While they were waiting for their money, the mercenaries and their families were crammed into the city. Out of work and bored, the troops started causing trouble, mostly harassing shopkeepers and merchants. Hanno the Great, leader of the African forces, compelled the men to leave Carthage and relocate to Sicca, a small border town to the south. The authorities in Carthage, fearing that the troops would want to return sooner rather than later, forced them to take their families with them. In hindsight, this was a dumb move, as they could have been used as hostages when the subsequent war broke out. The troops still had no reason to think that they wouldn't be paid, and they agreed to leave. Each man was given a gold coin for the journey. The men didn't travel together, but rather in small companies over several days. They were slowly gathering in Sicca, and dissatisfaction was starting to spread among the idle troops. A small but vocal minority started calling for violence. Foremost among these men would in time become leaders of the rebellion. They were the Libyan Mathos, Campanian Spendius, and Autaritus the Gaul. The men were now split along the ethnic lines. Language barriers prevented parts of the common soldiery from interacting with others outside of their group. On the other hand, officers could communicate using Punic as a sort of lingua franca. They would share the news and general attitudes of their respective men. There is also evidence that some of the soldiers were multilingual, which also eased communication. When the last of the troops finally arrived in Sicca, Hanno, with a small entourage, followed behind them. Notably, he didn't bring any funds with him, as his goal was not to pay the troops, but rather negotiate reduced rates. Hanno launched into a speech about how Carthage, after suffering such a terrible defeat, couldn't afford to pay everything owed to them. This went about as well as you could hope for. The army was unanimous in rejecting Hanno, and he was forced to retreat back to Carthage. High-ranking officers in the army were Carthaginians, and they too were forced to leave, as distrust of Punic leadership was growing. The mercenaries were now left with only low-ranking officers who took over command. This would be evident later in the war, due to their incompetence in leading a large army. They now decided to march towards Tunis, a coastal town near Carthage. During their march to Sicca and back, the troops were made aware of growing discontent among the African subjects. During the First Punic War, the Libyans were taxed heavily in order to pay for the war efforts. When these taxes then failed to reach their men serving in the army, it only made matters worse. It's likely that the Libyans were exchanging messages with their family and friends back home, widely spreading this discontent. When they reached Tunis, they occupied a nearby hill. A camp was built on a defensible position and guards were posted on all the routes leading to Carthage, effectively blocking off the city from the rest of Africa. The Carthaginians soon realized their mistake and were willing to accept all reasonable demands from the mercenaries. The first order of business was providing provisions for the army and their families. Goods arrived daily from Carthage, and interestingly, the troops set their own prices they were willing to pay, with Carthage making up the difference. When that was dealt with, envoys were sent from Carthage to discuss the terms with the army. They were presented with 3 demands, but in order to understand them, we first need to look into the structure of mercenary wages at the time. The wages consisted of 2 parts. The first part, called opsonion, was akin to a fixed salary paid daily for the duration of the employment. The other part, called sitarkia, was ration money, paid daily in coin or in actual provisions. In the ancient world, it was customary to pay opsonion in lump sums at convenient times, while sitarkia was crucial for the troops and had to be provided daily. In the final years of the war, the Carthaginians fell behind on both forms of payment. Now that we understand the structure of the wages, we can examine the demands presented by the mercenaries. The first demand was paying all the opsonion in full. This was completely reasonable, and it was accepted by the Carthaginians. The second demand was paying compensation for the dead horses to the cavalry. War horses were expensive, and it was customary for the employer to reimburse the riders for any dead animals. This too was accepted. The third and the final demand was paying the old sitarkia at the highest price of corn during the war. It's clear that the mercenaries wanted to extort as much money as possible from their former employer. This third demand was rejected, and the 2 sides couldn't reach an agreement. The army requested one of their former generals, Gisco, to come and settle the matter. When he arrived at Tunis, he made an agreement with the troops and started paying opsonion, leaving the money for the horses and rations for later. Distribution of the coins took some time, and while that was going on, the disgruntled group from Sicca was still growing. Mathos the Libyan feared retribution after the army disbanded, while his colleague Spendius, a runaway slave from Campania, feared extradition. They started fear-mongering, Mathos among the Libyans and Spendius among the other former slaves. The 2 of them exploited the pent-up anger of the army, and when Gisco insulted a Libyan soldier, the whole thing boiled over. Gisco and his entourage were thrown into prison, and the 2 men responsible for the revolt were elected generals. They were soon joined by Autaritus, leader of the Gallic contingent. The mutineers lacked a common identity, meaning that any group could break off or switch sides. To prevent this, all of them swore an oath. Although the contents of the oath are lost to history, their fates were now bound together in the eyes of the gods. The mercenaries were now in open revolt, and in 241 BCE the mercenary war had started. The brutality that would follow on both sides earned this war the moniker Truthless War. This was just a spark that oppressed Libyan communities were awaiting, and they too erupted into rebellion. 70,000 troops from Libya would soon join the mercenaries in Tunis. Taxes formerly paid to Carthage could now be diverted to the war effort. Former Phoenician colonies, most notably Hippo, Acra and Utica, stayed loyal to Carthage. The Cape Bon Peninsula, parts of Byzantium and Emporia also remained loyal. The revolt broke out around November, and ancient ships couldn't sail during the winter. As we have seen, the land routes to Carthage were already blocked, meaning that the city was completely cut off from its allies, at least for now. While all of this was happening, the Carthaginians weren't waiting idly. They started gathering what loyal mercenaries they could. Military-age men in the city were armed and cavalry was organized. They also prepared all the ships they had access to. Hanno the Great, commander of the African force, was chosen to conduct the war. He marched his troops outside of the city before the rebel army reached Tunis. Although his army was far too small to immediately act against the mercenaries, this would prove crucial later on, as the troops evaded the blockade and were free to move around the countryside. It's unknown where Hanno gathered his troops, but it's most likely that they were positioned somewhere on the still loyal Cape Bon Peninsula. The first batch of troops started arriving at Tunis. These were mostly fresh recruits, and the veteran mercenaries had to drill them into shape. The rebels, commanding around 40,000 troops at the time, expanded their blockade to Hippo Acra and Utica. They also captured the bridge on the Bagradas River west of Carthage, leaving a large garrison there. When the mercenaries were thus stretched out, Hanno led his army, approximately 10,000 strong, to Utica. He was accompanied by a large contingent of war elephants. They circumvented the garrison on Bagradas by crossing the river further upstream, catching the besiegers at Utica by surprise. Hanno reached the city before they could react, and he took siege engines from the walls. With these, he intimidated the besiegers and used his elephants to break into the fortified camp. The terrified mercenaries took flight, but here Hanno shows his inexperience. Instead of pursuing them, he took control of the camp and returned back to the city. The routed troops gathered on a nearby hilltop visible from the city walls. Hanno's troops started foraging around the camp, and when the mercenaries saw this, they seized the opportunity. These mercenaries were veterans of Hamilcar's hit-and-run tactics back on Sicily, and they knew how to disengage from an unfavorable fight, only to strike when the balance of power had shifted. This was one such occasion, and they sallied from the hill in force. Carthaginians were taken by surprise, and many of them were killed, with the rest retreating back towards the city. The troops regrouped under the city wall, and the rebels abandoned the pursuit. Perhaps it was the fear of the elephants that stopped their advance. In any case, Hanno gathered what was left of his force and marched north after this indecisive altercation. The rebels captured siege equipment used by the Carthaginians. They could now leave far fewer men to besiege the city, while the rest went into pursuit of Hanno and his small army. For days the two armies were locked in an endless game of cat and mouse, neither side willing to commit to a full-scale battle. Libyan Mathos, who was conducting the siege of Hippo Acra, finally sent reinforcements to the rebel force, while Spendius, who was commanding the troops near Bagradas Bridge, moved north to take control of the army. He used his fresh troops and the previously captured siege engines to renew the siege of Utica. Hanno was now trapped in no man's land between the two armies besieging Utica and Hippo Acra. Our focus now switches to Hamilcar Barca, who was in Carthage from the end of the First Punic War. With Hanno gone, Hamilcar was now the most senior military figure in the city. He did all he could to raise another army. He gathered newly recruited mercenaries and rebel deserters. He also organized citizen cavalry and infantry. This new army numbered 10,000 men in total. They were accompanied by a further 70 war elephants. Hamilcar needed some time to prepare this army, as the citizen troops were fresh recruits who needed extensive drilling to get them into shape. Not long after Hanno's disaster at Utica, the army was ready, and Hamilcar made his first move of the war in the early 240 BCE. Carthage was under siege from Tunis, the rebel camp on the bridge over Bagradas River was still blocking that passage, and the harsh winds made the voyage by sea too dangerous. This left Hamilcar with few options. His army was too small to attack Tunis or the bridge, so he chose a more stealthy approach. He made all the necessary preparations and waited for favorable winds. When a great gale from the east arose, the mouth of the river Bagradas withdrew, revealing a shallow passage near the coast. Hamilcar crossed the river, surprising both the Carthaginians and the rebels alike. When Spendius heard the news of this crossing, he took a large part of the men besieging Utica and sped off to meet Hamilcar. He also sent orders to the bridge, and the men there did likewise. The two armies, numbering around 20,000 men in total, met Hamilcar, who was marching up the Bagradas River. Hamilcar used his elephants as a vanguard, placing them in front of the other troops. The cavalry and light skirmishers were placed behind the elephants. The rest of the troops, meaning heavy infantry, were placed in the last line of the formation. When the enemy troops approached, he ordered his elephants and the cavalry to wheel around and his heavy troops to press forth. Seeing the vanguard turn around and retreat, the rebels mistook it for a full rout and charged in, breaking formation. When they got sufficiently close, Hamilcar sent a signal and the vanguard turned once again, rushing back into the rebel troops. This force, consisting mostly of fresh Libyan recruits, panicked and fell into a disorderly flight, many of them dying in this confusion. 6,000 rebels were killed with a further 2,000 captured. Although the feigned retreat tactic used in the battle was fairly simple, it shows that Hamilcar's troops were well disciplined and properly drilled in such a short time. They continued their march towards the Bagradas Bridge. The rebels there offered him no resistance, retreating back to Tunis as soon as Hamilcar appeared on the horizon. Spendius was among these troops. Hamilcar tore down the camp near the bridge, lifted the siege of Utica, and marched along the countryside, capturing several towns in the area. As the trade routes in the Mediterranean were beginning to open in early spring, a number of enterprising merchants tried to profit by trading with the rebels. The Carthaginians set up patrols along the North African coast, and by the early summer, they captured over 500 Italian merchants, along with many others. When the Roman delegation came to inquire about their countrymen, we are told that the Carthaginians were so amicable that the Romans decided to ban any Italian from dealing with the rebels. They also authorized their merchants to bring all the necessary goods to Carthage and return the almost 3,000 Carthaginian prisoners who were still in Rome. The Carthaginians were now in a much better position than at the outbreak of the war, while the rebels were experiencing their first setbacks. Spendius gathered 6,000 troops at Tunis, with Autaritus gathering a further 2,000 Gauls. Together they set out from the city and followed Hamilcar, keeping firmly to the high ground. They were avoiding conflict as they had no answer for his elephants and cavalry. Mathos the Libyan, who was still keeping up the siege at Hippo Acra, sent word to his countrymen and the Numidians. The Libyans raised a fresh batch of troops and sent them after Hamilcar, while the Numidians sent their formidable cavalry. The three different forces now converged onto Hamilcar. He was positioned in the middle of a plain surrounded by mountains. His strength was on the flat land where he could effectively use his elephants, and the rebels were not coming to him. The three different groups were separated, but close enough to react. If Hamilcar tried to attack one of them or make a break for it over the mountains, they all would come down on him. Hamilcar Barca, the best Carthaginian general, was now trapped deep within enemy territory. While in this difficult situation, Narr'havas, leader of the Numidians, approached his camp with a small entourage and requested an audience with Hamilcar. He was admitted to the camp, leaving his men behind. Narr'havas praised Hamilcar and pleaded his allegiance to him. Hamilcar was so pleased with this that he promised him one of his daughters in marriage. We don't have much information on Narr'havas, but it seems that he is a relative, possibly uncle, of the famous Numidian king Massinissa, who would go on to ally with the Romans and defeat the Carthaginians in the Battle of Zama. Later in life, Massinissa would also cause the Third Punic War and the eventual destruction of Carthage. But for now, Narr'havas and his 2,000 cavalry sided with the Carthaginians. With this new ally, Hamilcar marched out of the camp and deployed for battle. Spendius, probably fearing further defections to the enemy side, combined the two forces and attacked Hamilcar. We don't have any details of this battle, but we are told by Polybius that the battle was hard, the elephants played an important role, and Narr'havas performed brilliant feats. From this we can surmise the likely course of the events. Narr'havas and his cavalry broke their counterparts, while Hamilcar used the elephants to smash the infantry. Polybius claims 10,000 dead and 4,000 captured rebels, but this has to be an overstatement. Hamilcar offered amnesty to the captured troops. Their disloyalty would be forgotten if they re-enlisted into his army. Those uninterested in service were given immunity and were free to go, so long as they didn't rejoin the rebellion. While the Carthaginians were enjoying new successes in the south, they were struck by another heavy blow in the north. Mercenaries employed in Sardinia rebelled in the summer of 240. They killed their commander and took control of some forts on the island, but their numbers were far too small to capture any larger towns. It's unclear why they rebelled, but their future actions point towards growing resentment of the Carthaginian population they were paid to protect. Carthaginians sent a swift response. Newly hired mercenaries were sent under the command of yet another Hanno, possibly the one appearing in the First Punic War. When this new force reached Sardinia, the mercenaries saw they had better prospects on the other side. They crucified Hanno and joined the mutineers. This mercenary force, now sufficiently strong, captured all towns on the island. Every Carthaginian on the island was tortured and killed. The native Sardinian population didn't side with either party initially. From this point on, Polybius is less interested in army movements and battles. His primary focus switches to psychological and moral differences between the civilized Carthaginians and the barbaric rebels, as he describes them. Following his victory, Hamilcar continued harassing Libyan communities. Eventually, he had to leave the Libyan heartland, choosing to spend the winter near the friendly coastal cities of Byzacium. There he could more easily acquire supplies for his men. Hanno the Great was somewhere around Carthage with his troops, possibly protecting the friendly Cape Bon Peninsula. The three rebel generals now gathered near Hippo Acra. The army got word of the leniency shown by Hamilcar, and talks of abandoning the rebellion were spreading amongst them. The generals knew that they had to take drastic measures in order to keep their men from deserting. In the sinister events that were about to take place, Gisco, the Carthaginian general from the start of the story, had an unfortunate role to play. Spendius called upon the army assembly. When the men gathered, he showed them a letter he received from the rebels in Sardinia. In this letter, the rebels warned him about an existing plot to release Gisco and defect to the Carthaginian side. While he was explaining this to the army, he was interrupted by another messenger. This one arrived from Tunis with the same message. The army was now thoroughly roused, and Autaritus the Gaul took over the main word. He proclaimed that the only way to prevent further desertion from the army was to torture Gisco and the other Carthaginian captives to death. A couple of the old veterans from Sicily who served under his leadership protested the torturing, but they were immediately stoned to death by their comrades. The army was radicalized within an afternoon, and there was no turning back. Gisco, the envoys captured with him, and the other Carthaginian prisoners, numbering around 700 in total, were dismembered and thrown into a pit to die. The first vile act of the truceless war was committed, and the mercy previously shown by Hamilcar would soon be only a distant memory. The rite of burial was important in Punic culture, and the Carthaginians sent heralds to ask for the bodies of mutilated men. Although the rebels didn't hurt them, they announced that any further heralds or envoys would be dealt with in the same way as Gisco. They also warned that any future Carthaginian captives would be tortured and killed. When Hamilcar heard of this, he was furious. During the Sicilian campaign, Gisco was one of his direct subordinates, and the two men had an amicable relationship. As a response, Hamilcar abandoned his merciful practices. From then on, his only goal was to exterminate all rebels in North Africa. All captured prisoners in the future were trampled to death by elephants, an unusually cruel punishment. The summer of 239 was now in full swing. Hamilcar fought several skirmishes inside the Libyan territory, but he couldn't score any major victories. He invited Hanno to join him, thinking that the combined army would have a better chance of bringing this war to a close. Hanno first reinforced Hippo Acra and Utica, and then marched south to meet up with Hamilcar. The combined army now numbered over 20,000 troops, but the two generals didn't see eye to eye. Hanno refused to follow Hamilcar's hit-and-run tactics, and Hamilcar didn't want to risk the army with an all-out engagement at Tunis. For months the two men quarreled, leaving the army in a dangerous situation. The Senate in Carthage could see this, and they decided that one of the generals had to return home, leaving the other with full control. They couldn't agree on whom to recall, and they left it to the army to decide. The men took the vote, and Hamilcar was chosen as the sole commander of the army. While this was going on, Carthage was hit with a series of disasters, one after another. First, a large convoy carrying food and other supplies from Emporia was caught in a summer storm and sunk. These supplies were crucial not only for Carthage but also for Utica and Hippo Acra. These cities, now on the brink of starvation, had no other choice but to join the rebellion. Carthaginian troops in the cities were killed and thrown from the walls. The rebel armies around these cities were now free to move, and they switched focus, mounting a full-scale siege of Carthage. The Romans and the Syracusans now doubled their efforts to supply Carthage, no doubt profiting handsomely in the process. On the other hand, Hamilcar did all he could to cut off the besiegers from their supplies. In early 238, during the hard winter months, the rebels finally ran out of food and had to lift the siege of Carthage. They returned to Tunis, but this didn't ease their troubles with the supplies, as Hamilcar was still blockading the roads in the area. The rebels had no other choice but to gather an army and march against Hamilcar. Polybius claims that they gathered 50,000 troops in total. This force was commanded by Spendius and Autaritus, but also by a new Libyan general, Zarzas. Mathua stayed behind in Tunis, as he was a good organizer but a bad field commander. This large force was enough to dislodge Hamilcar. Not in a position to fight, he retreated to the Libyan countryside. The rebel army now chased after him, hoping to strike a final blow. For the next several months, the two armies were locked in a series of marches and maneuvers accompanied by countless skirmishes. Hamilcar was a far better general than his counterparts, and in the end he managed to encircle them in a place called the Saw. We are not told what or where this place was, but it must have been a large plain surrounded by high mountains. Perhaps not unlike the famous Caudine Forks, where the Roman army was trapped some 80 years earlier. The rebel army was so afraid of the elephants and the cavalry that they refused to fight. Hamilcar built a camp on the exit of the Saw and erected simple palisades around the enemy. For weeks the two armies were locked in a standstill, but while Carthaginians could easily forage for supplies, the rebels soon ran out of food. The rebels were most likely waiting for Mathos to come and relieve them, but the reinforcements never came. Things got so bad that in the end the men had to resort to cannibalism to survive. When they finally realized that no help was coming, the rebel generals, knowing full well what fate awaited them, decided to surrender to Hamilcar. Spendius, Autaritus and Zarzas, along with the 7 high-ranking officers, went to the Punic camp to negotiate. Interestingly, Hamilcar agreed to let the troops go if they surrendered their arms. His only other demand was that the 10 officers stay as his prisoners. Having thus agreed on the terms of the surrender, the only thing left was to inform the army. But before that could be done, someone in the rebel camp shouted that their generals were kidnapped and they took up arms. The full force of the Punic army was brought upon them and the rebels were annihilated. It's unclear what caused this sudden reversal. Did Hamilcar plan this from the start, or did he simply allow things to escalate? Whatever the case, 40,000 rebel troops perished on that day. After this victory, Hamilcar marched his troops to Tunis. Every rebel city in his way surrendered after hearing the news of the battle. Hamilcar set up his camp on the south side of the city, while his subordinate Hannibal encamped on the north side with half the army. Hamilcar was in no hurry to risk his men, and he was happy to wait out the siege. Rebels in Tunis were now blockaded, and it was only a matter of time before they succumbed to starvation. Hamilcar crucified the 10 captured officers in the full view of the city. This was a clear message to the rebels. Peace was not an option. It's clear that Hamilcar's ruthless methods kept this war going. If the rebels could expect leniency shown at the start of the war, most, if not all of them, would already surrender. But considering those days were long gone, there were still more twists left in this war. We are told by Polybius that Hannibal was a negligent commander and that his camp was poorly defended. Mathos must have realized this. He charged out of the city and attacked the camp. The unprepared troops were easily killed or routed, and Hannibal, along with 30 Carthaginian nobles, was captured. Before returning to the safety of his walls, Mathos took down the crucified officers. In their stead, he crucified Hannibal using the same cross Spendius was attached to. Spendius was laid to rest, and the Carthaginian nobles were sacrificed upon his grave. This was another big moral blow to the Carthaginians, but more importantly, this was a major tactical blunder. Hamilcar was now outnumbered again, and he had to lift the siege. He marched his army to the Bagradas bridge. There he left a garrison, a few thousand strong, with support from the cavalry and elephants. With the rest of the army, estimated at 7,000 or 8,000 strong, he marched to the mouth of the river. The cities of Hippoacra and Utica were still in rebel hands, and he tried to cut them off from the army in Tunis. The Carthaginians, now again in distress, gathered all the military-aged men in the city. Command was given to Hanno, and they were sent off to reinforce Hamilcar. The army was accompanied by 30 senators. Their task was to resolve any differences between the two generals and compel them to work together. They were successful, and Hamilcar and Hanno cooperated until the end of the war. At this point, Polybius is anxious to end this story, and he is scant on details. He left it to modern historians to infer the troop movements in these later stages. Mathos left Tunis and probably went to Libya to stir up additional support. But by now the people were tired of years of war and he was unsuccessful. From there he proceeded to the coastal regions of Byzacium. The Carthaginians didn't stay long around Bagradas, and under the joint command of Hamilcar and Hanno, they too marched to Byzacium. The two armies met near an old Phoenician colony called Leptis Minor. Several skirmishes were fought there, and they went in Carthaginian favor. It was most likely Hamilcar's military genius that prevailed once more. Mathos was trying to avoid a full-scale engagement, but he was left with no other choice, and the two armies met on the field. The old veterans from Sicily were by now all but gone, the rebel army consisting mostly of new Libyan recruits. Against the battle-hardened Carthaginians under Hamilcar's command, they stood no chance. The army was destroyed and Mathos was captured. The Libyan communities now saw the writing on the wall, and one after another they surrendered. The last two holdouts of the rebellion were the treacherous cities of Hippoacra and Utica. They feared vengeance for their treatment of the Carthaginian garrison earlier in the war. When the two generals besieged the cities, it took them only a few days to agree to every Carthaginian demand and surrender. Evidence points to cities not being treated too harshly after the war. The same could not be said for the leading rebel supporters. Mathos and his senior officers were marched into Carthage in a victorious procession akin to a Roman triumph. The men responsible for the rebellion were crucified on the main square of the city and left to rot under the harsh sun as a message to all current and future employees. In March of 237 BCE, after 3 years and 4 months, the truceless war was finally over. The war was a costly affair for the Carthaginians, far costlier than the initial sum owed to the mercenaries. During these few short years, the city found itself on the brink of collapse several times, but in the end they rose up and crushed the rebellion. Hamilcar Barca, now hailed savior of the city, gained the most from the war. The Senate and the entire city were now staunchly pro-Barcid. His colleague and former rival Hanno fell into obscurity, only appearing as the loudest critic of the pro-Barcid faction during the Second Punic War. The Libyan community suffered the most during the war. Large numbers of men and funds extracted for the war effort, combined with several large-scale raids by the Carthaginians, must have put a strain on the Africans. But it was in Carthage's best interest to quickly restore Libya, if only to extract more taxes and levies from them. Soon the funds from Spain would come flowing into Carthage, amplifying the restoration. These efforts would soon bear fruit, as during Hannibal's invasion of Italy, his Libyan troops would prove the most loyal and dependable. During the long years of campaigning in Spain and Italy, we hear of no large-scale mutinies or defections, meaning that the Barcids learned their lesson and diligently paid their troops on time and in full. One loose end we still have to tie up is the fate of the mutineers on Sardinia. After taking the island, the mercenaries asked Rome for help, hoping to be treated like the Mamertines years prior. But the Romans refused to break the treaty of the First Punic War, and the mercenaries were left to their own accord. In 238, the indigenous Sardinian population rose up and overran the mercenaries, who fled to Italy. Having ended the rebellion in Africa, Hamilcar was preparing an army to recapture Sardinia. In the midst of these preparations came a message from Rome. They saw this new army as a threat to Italy and they declared war. The Carthaginians, still exhausted by the recent rebellion, pleaded with the Romans to prevent another war so soon. The Romans agreed to abandon this cause if the Carthaginians abandoned Sardinia and paid an indemnity of 1,200 talents. The Carthaginians had no choice but to accept, and Sardinia passed into Roman control. The Carthaginians never forgot the loss of Sardinia, and it was one of the crucial factors that would lead to the outbreak of the Second Punic War. It's unclear why this sudden reversal of policy towards Carthage, but we must remember that the Senate consisted of individuals with differing fears and ambitions. Even before the outbreak of the Truceless War, Hamilcar was planning a Spanish campaign. Now, having dealt with all the pressing issues, he finally had the chance to go. During a ritual ceremony before departure, Hamilcar made his 9-year-old son Hannibal swear an oath to never be a friend to the Romans. Young Hannibal would take this oath to heart, never forgetting the promise made on that fateful day. Hamilcar, accompanied by his son Hannibal, his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and a large host, crossed into Spain. Join us next time as we discuss the Barcid conquest of Iberia. Thank you for watching our video, we hope you liked it. If you enjoyed this series, consider supporting us on Patreon. It would mean a lot to us and help us make even more videos in the future.